Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. So finally one of these Patreon only documentaries has been released on this channel and it's here for you to watch, and we will watch it together. But first I'd like to say a few words. And first off, we need to thank the Patreon supporters, because many of these people on Patreon, they have watched this content and they appreciated it so much, and particularly also the one I made about Date Masamune and the one I made about the Templars, the Crusaders, that they said that it was a shame that the rest of you, members of the community, couldn't watch it, so they brought up this idea of perhaps releasing at least some of these Patreon documentaries after a certain amount of time from release, so that everyone could watch them. And yes, this has been done. I've chosen this video. This video was made 3 months ago on the late Roman Empire. I know that a lot of you wanted to watch this video. Some people couldn't afford to support me on Patreon, and so I decided to make this available now for you. So big thanks to Patreon supporters and their generosity. It really warms my heart that people enjoy the content so much and also consider other members of the community, I would like to say other brethren and sisters of the community, as to think in a generous way. And this shows really that we have created not only a community here in the Metatron channel, not only a community of people who are interested in the same thing, but people with one mind that can show their generosity among themselves. So this documentary was created thanks to Patreon support, because all of these documentaries, which I release each month on the 30th of each month, are different from the videos that I make on YouTube, because I have to use a budget. I have a budget to create them, which is a budget that I get through donations. At least part of the donations I use to make these videos. And thanks to this budget, I can go to, for example, this video that you're about to see, we went to not Roman really, but ancient Greek ruins of Greek colonies here in Sicily. Really, and we're talking about walls and columns and temples and ruins that are over 2,000 years old. I go there with a troupe. They are shot with highly professional equipment that I couldn't afford, and that's because there is a photographer that works for me and an entire troupe. And for future videos I'm considering also hiring actors, actresses, and trying to recreate these atmospheric sections that you will see are part of these videos, and because we look through this historical education through the eyes and memories of warriors of the time. Now, before getting into the actual video, I'd like to first off say, if you enjoy Roman cooking and Roman cookery, please check out my friend Salvo's latest video on Roman cookery on You Better Call Sal channel, link in the description below. He has started an actual series. Now, this very first video is mostly about a historical video on Roman cookery, but each Sunday he will be actually making a Roman recipe, a Roman cookery that you can learn how to make in your home with your available ingredients. Every Sunday you will find it on You Better Call Sal channel, so make sure to subscribe. Also, some people have asked me what happened to MetatronGemini, which was a channel that I had made on Vidme. And unfortunately, as you know, Vidme went out of business, so of course MetatronGemini also disappeared. But it shall rise again as a phoenix. I have created a MetatronGemini Twitch account, and I will be starting to stream regularly on Twitch, so make sure you will find a link in the description below again, to subscribe, to follow me on Twitch. You can interact with me, and I will be playing loads of video games, retro gaming, because I was born in the 80s, bro. And I will be playing games which have to do with ancient Rome, like Rise, Son of Rome, Dark Souls, For Honor, and whatever you want to see me play while I chat with you. Okay, enough about that. Let's watch the documentary together, and at the end of the documentary I can talk to you more about this decision I made to make these documentaries public. Mankind is dust. Our lives fading glares. Even those who shine are silenced by time. The days of glory are long gone. The words of Cicero, Caesar, are reflections of what once was. And now we are all wanderers in an ever-changing world. Roman, a word once permeated with power, fear, honor, is now saturated with the unknown. Reality is a mirror, shattered, destroyed out of rage, born from the fear of our own deformed reflections. We abandoned our traditions for a new foreign god. The path, once lit, is narrow and dark. I am Roman. My days will soon come to an end. But within me, though feeble and distant, I still hear the voice of my ancestors. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. The late antiquity and the late Roman Empire is a very misunderstood era, and it's a very misunderstood topic. A lot of people consider it to be just a mere shadow of the glory that Rome used to have, but this is a very incomplete approach, it's a very incomplete answer. Now, in this video we will try to see both the positive things, the negative things, because of course there were problems during the late Roman Empire, just like there were problems during the Republic and just like there were problems during the Empire. But the thing is that often when we focus and we imagine the times of Caesar, so Republican times, we focus on just the accomplishments, just the amazing things, the amazing deeds performed specifically by Caesar, but also by many others. And then we focus on the glory of the victory, for example, of Scipio Africanus against Carthage, without really taking into consideration all the damage that was done during the Punic Wars to the Roman Republic, and also the span of time that Hannibal stayed in Italy, and we're talking years. But this is not something that only we do. I mean, if we read Vegetius, for example, and he is talking about the times of Caesar, and he's talking about the Republican times, and yes, he's sort of guilty of the same thing. He's always saying, like, things are not how they used to be. And to be honest, I think that this is something that we tend to do a lot, even when we consider our teenage years, for example, and then we think back, in my case, of the 80s and 90s, and then I start thinking, good old times when we had no mobile phones and there was no internet connection, and whenever you wanted to really know how something was done, you had to actually have a human interaction. We would go and ask your friends and ask your mates, and perhaps we could just go out and have fun all together, play football in the middle of the street, whereas now kids mostly play FIFA probably. So yes, of course, it's this nostalgic feeling that also changes our memories a bit, and we tend to remember just the good things, and this is something that the Romans did as well. But with the late Roman Empire, things are really put into a completely different perspective if you think about it, because whenever we think of the late Roman Empire, we consider it to be a complete total failure, a huge thorough destruction of morals and the power and glory of the imperial times, where instead everything was going well, a period of destruction and poverty and whatever. But that's not the case, and to say this, in this video, I am basing the information I'm giving in this video apart from my personal university studies, but also to the Oxford Centre of Studies for Late Antiquity. So if you're interested, I will leave a link down below so that you can go and check these facts out yourself. I will be reading some of the information from that site because it's really, really well put. But of course, you can find the actual bulk of information there actually studying. Late Antiquity is a periodization used by historians to describe the time of transition from classical antiquity to the Middle Ages in both mainland Europe and the Mediterranean world. Precise boundaries for the period are a matter of debate. A historian of the period, Peter Brown, proposed a period between the 2nd and the 8th centuries. Generally, it can be thought of as from the end of the Roman Empire's crisis of the 3rd century to the reorganization of the Eastern Roman Empire under Heraclius and the Muslim conquest in the mid-7th century. I've been on the frontier for years now. This area of the world, cold, gloomy, bleak. I miss my home. The beautiful and coloured nature, rich with sunshine that surrounds the eternal city. My bones ache for Rome, and yet I'm afraid that by the time I will be back, will I find it? Will it be there? But my work here will be done. According to the Oxford Centre for Late Antiquity, the late Roman Empire was a formidable and successful power after some very difficult times in the mid-3rd century. So the mood that we see through the memories and words of our legionary Marcus in this documentary is that of those specific times in which the Western Roman Empire was undergoing a period of difficulty and change. But for most of the 4th century, the greater part of the Roman world enjoyed a period of tranquility and prosperity, though this ended dramatically in the Balkan provinces in 378, when the Emperor Valens was defeated and killed at the hands of the Goths. Now, as we said, in the 5th century, the Western Empire was gradually overrun by Germanic invaders. But by contrast, the Eastern Empire, now centered on the new capital city of Constantinople, built on the basis of the ancient Byzantium, flourished during the 5th century, and in the 6th, under the Emperor Justinian, even launched a program of reconquest of several of the western provinces. So when we talk about late Roman Empire or late Roman period, we're talking about AD 250 to AD 450, just to have a specific periodization. And it saw very important changes within the empire, which included a realignment of political power away from the cities and in favor of central state. But another very important concept, another very important line which marks a huge difference from classical antiquity is the abandonment of Roman polytheism, which our friend legionary Marcus mentions, in favor of the new Christian religion. Now, this religious change is incredibly important. It will determine the religious and cultural future of Western Eurasia, and it will have political, social, economic and cultural repercussions. I have been reading the De Bello Gallico lately, written by Caesar himself, the hero, the general. I've been fascinated by his image my entire life. My father was a centurion, his father a gladiator, who had won liberty and respect with his courage and strength. I thought that joining the legions, I could have become more like him. I would have found honor, glory. And yet, every cold night at the front, my thoughts linger on one single memory. home. Roman Empire underwent considerable social, cultural and organizational change, starting with the reign of Diocletian, or, to use his actual Latin name, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus Augustus, in classical pronunciation. He is the one who began the custom of splitting the empire into eastern and western halves, ruled by multiple emperors. This was a new concept. Beginning with Constantine the Great, the empire was Christianized, and this was another big difference from the classical antiquity. And the new capital founded at Constantinople. Migrations of Germanic tribes disrupted Roman rule from the late 4th century onwards, culminating in the eventual collapse of the empire in the west in 476. The empire was then replaced by the so-called barbarian kingdoms. The resultant cultural fusion of Greco-Roman, Germanic and Christian traditions formed the cultural foundation of Europe. Diocletianus was a Roman emperor from 284 to 305. Interestingly enough, he rose through the ranks of the military to become Roman cavalry commander to the Emperor Carus. Now, after the death of the emperor and his son on campaign in Persia, Diocletianus, or Diocletianus to use ecclesiastical pronunciation, was proclaimed emperor. An interesting concept that he brings up is also the concept of delegation. He delegated on 1st March 293, appointing Galerius and Constantinus as Caesars, junior co-emperors. And under this tetrarchy, or rule of 4, each emperor would rule over a quarter division of the empire. He was a successful commander, a successful leader, securing the empire's borders, defeating Sarmatians and Carpi between 285 and 299. The later Roman Empire was in a sense a network of cities. Archaeology now provides literary sources to document the transformation after the collapse of cities in the Mediterranean basin. The city of Rome went from a population of 800,000 towards the beginning of the period to a population of 30,000 towards the end of the period, with the most precipitous drop happening during the breaking of the aqueduct during the Gothic Wars. We will now discuss the differences between the late Roman army and the imperial army of the Principate. The term Principate is the name sometimes given to the first period of the Roman Empire, mostly to distinguish it from the late Roman Empire. With Principate, we begin from the reign of Augustus, or Augustus, in 27 BC, until the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, in 284 Anno Domini. After that, we have the evolution into the so-called Dominate, which is another name for the late Roman Empire. So first off, we'll talk about sizes, because this is a topic that is still under debate. Scholars estimate that the size of the 4th century army will be ranging from 400,000 soldiers to over 1 million effectives. Now that's interesting because the 2nd century army was around 400,000 soldiers. So it's either they were equals or it will be 2 to 3 times larger. Unfortunately, this highly divergent data is due to fragmentary evidence, which is one of the first differences between the Principate and the Dominate. The records of late Roman Empire is very scarce and they were not well kept, unlike the much better documented 2nd century army. Now, near the imperial capitals in the 4th century army, we have the creation of large escort armies, which normally would be made of either 20,000 or 30,000 troops, and these were elite troops called Palatini, who were the sort of elite soldiers who took the place of the Praetorians. Differently from the popular image, the role of cavalry in the late army does not appear to have been greatly enhanced as compared with the army of the Principate. So the proportions were similar. The actual difference between the cavalry of the Principate and the cavalry of the late Roman Empire is that the latter would have a greater number of specialized units. For example, extra heavy shock cavalry called cataphracti. Now when we say cataphract, we are talking about a form of heavy armored cavalry. Both the rider and the steed would be covered in scale armor, using lances as their weapons, or sometimes contos. So as we look very briefly into the evolution of mounted soldiers, we can see how the equites probably paved the way to the future cataphracts, which will themselves probably pave the way to the famous European knights. Now, there are many different changes that occurred if we compare the army of the Principate to the late Roman army, and of course I can't really cover them all in one video. They probably need a dedicated video, but just to underline the most important ones, we have to consider that not all changes were political in nature. We also have the mid-3rd century crisis, which was both a military and an economic crisis, a series of military catastrophes in 251 and 271, when Alpine regions of Italy, Gaul, the Balkans and the East were overrun by Sarmatians, by Goths, by Persians. Also, the devastating effects of pandemics had weakened the Roman army, with a mortality rate of 15 to 30% in the empire as a whole. As a matter of fact, I think the concept of late antiquity and the late Roman Empire as well suffers from a similar fate that the terminology Dark Ages suffers from. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the word Dark Ages, with Dark Ages originally, scholars meant the period from the fall of Rome all the way up, including the entirety of the Middle Ages, all the way up to the Renaissance. So when the Renaissance came about, then it was the time of enlightenment. But before that, it was just a dark time. And of course, this is a very misleading term. In fact, in our day and age, a lot of scholars and a lot of historians, not only they changed the meaning of the Dark Ages from the entirety of the Middle Ages to just from the fall of Rome to the 10th century. But many other scholars, and okay, I'm not a scholar, but I include myself into one of those people who does what I'm about to say, decided to completely stop using the term altogether. Why? Because the idea of the term Dark Ages is the concept of a decline, a period of darkness, but that does not work when you start looking at what people actually managed to do and to achieve in, for example, the Middle Ages, okay? And if we look at the amazing cathedrals, but even the technological developments, even when we look at medieval and late medieval full plate armor, how can that be considered to be something created by a people that were ignorant and living in darkness? So of course that's not the case, but even when we just use it as an alternative for late antiquity, so for example from the end of the Western Roman Empire to whatever the 8th century or whatever you wish, and so then you do have to consider that in that specific time then we have the Holy Roman Empire, we have the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, and that was a very successful power. And of course there will be a lot of problems again, and we will have, for example, the damage caused by the plague, the Black Plague, the Black Death, for example, and I have a dedicated video. But regardless of that, I myself have decided not to use the term Dark Ages anymore and refer to this specific time as late antiquity, because it's more neutral and that helps us avoid misconceptions. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this. So one of the reasons why I decided to make these documentaries public is because, or some of these documentaries public, is because when I first started making Patreon-only documentaries, it was because it was my way to thank Patreon supporters for their support. One documentary, well-made, well-researched, each month on the 30th. But now on Patreon I make weekly content. I make sneak peeks where I show all the weapons and armor that I get and they see it. I also make I'm also preparing other kinds of Patreon dedicated videos that of course won't be high, sort of medium budget as the documentaries are, but they are still videos that they get. And and all of this is for people who support me with $1. For people who support me with more, there are lots of different tiers, like $5. I'm also hiring models, and that includes myself, although I'm not a model, but and a photographer to take professionally taken pictures to recreate atmospheric representations, high quality, shot with a Nikon D850 of either ancient Japan, ancient Rome, and medieval times, and they can have access to this and download these high quality pictures to have their own collection. There are also constant polls on Patreon, and I of course try to interact with my Patreon supporters. So considering the fact that I now offer a lot of different things on Patreon, I decided that the documentaries, after a certain amount of time, so Patreon supporters will still have early access, some of these documentaries will be released here on YouTube. Okay, but I hope that you enjoyed this. I wish to thank the people who support me on Patreon because they are the ones who help my channel go through these very difficult times of demonetization and ad apocalypse. If it wasn't for them, I don't know how I could continue making content here. But I also wish to thank all the other noble ones, because thanks to you commenting, liking my content, watching my videos and sharing them, you are really an army, and you are really helping the Metatron spread his wings. Thank you so much for your dedication, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.